Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Crisis on Infinite Earths number 1 from 1985 in DC Comics. There have been many crises across DC's long and storied history, but for better or for worse, there is still only one crisis. The DCU has been riven by crises since at least 1963, and the publication of Crisis on Earth 1 in issue 21 of Justice League of America. That story featured the first meeting between the Justice League and the Justice Society, building on events in The Flash that had already established that the company's Golden Age heroes lived on a separate Earth from their contemporary counterparts. Back in the early 1960s, the idea of a multiverse of heroes, with each Earth protected by different and distinct versions of familiar icons, was still fresh. Alternate universes and parallel Earths had been a staple of sci-fi stories for quite some time, and the trope found a true and lasting home in the realm of comic books. But by 1985, decades of crises had taken their toll on the fictional fabric of DC Comics, with the schema of various alternate universes having grown prohibitively complicated and intimidating. Whether or not it was actually true that the multiple Earths had become a barrier to legibility for the line, one of the great unanswerables in comics history, I'd posit, the creators themselves believed it, and so the plan was hatched to rectify the problem. Now, there are two facts which must be remembered at all times when discussing the crisis. In the first place, the story did not need to exist. It was the product of the agitation of a specific group of DC editors and creators who came together for the purpose of consolidating the company's lore, a process that ultimately birthed not merely the crisis, but the first edition of Who's Who as well. All of the putative goals of the crisis could have been accomplished in other ways. All the reboots, the relaunches, and the streamlining enabled by the crisis could easily have been achieved by other less ostentatious means. That leads inexorably to the second fact at hand. Despite its formidable reputation, Crisis on Infinite Earths was a labor of love from the first panel to the last. The people who made this book, and especially writer Marv Wolfman and penciler George Pérez, really wanted to make it. After all, it was initially designed as a celebration of the company's 50th birthday, the biggest story ever, supposedly featuring every single character who had ever appeared in a DC book. For Wolfman and Pérez, what I always return to is the fact that their lives would almost certainly have been much easier had they not done the crisis. In frank terms, it was a major hassle for everyone involved. The key ingredient across all 12 issues is simply raw enthusiasm. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Crisis on Infinite Earths number 2 from 1985 in DC Comics. If the first issue was all about place setting, establishing the scale and scope of the series to come, the whole world will live, world will die thing, the second issue is about laying the foundation of the rather elaborate plot. Now, there's no getting around the fact that Crisis holds the intimidating reputation as a series more discussed than read, for all its status as a cornerstone not just for DC Comics, but as the first great crossover event of the modern era. It's a difficult series to read for many. Part of that has to do with the fact that there's just so much going on, and this issue is a great example of that. It begins with a few pages of Anthro, a caveman character whose book lasted 6 issues back in the late 60s, before giving us the legion of superheroes dealing with a horde of woolly mammoths, Batman fighting the Joker with a disturbing cameo from a dying Flash, a trip to the Great Disaster to check in on Jack Kirby's Command D, DC's ancient Atlantis at its zenith during Earth's Ice Age, speaking roles for both the Earth 1 and Earth 2 Supermen, and even a quick check-in with those wacky Guardians of the Universe on their home planet of Oa. That's not even mentioning the ongoing story, the actual story, featuring the decline of the Monitor and teasing the appearance of his great opposite number, the fearsome Anti-Monitor. That's a lot for a normal-sized comic book, and the whole thing would be gibberish if not for the outsized talents of George Pérez, perhaps the only person in history who'd willingly sign up to draw all of this. But again, for all the story's reputation, he's clearly having an absolute blast putting all these disparate pieces together. The idea of a threat so big it threatens all of time simultaneously, from the Big Bang on up, is still difficult to get one's head around. How does that work exactly? It's a real trip, the best kind of head-scratcher in comic book form. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Crisis on Infinite Earths number 3 from 1985 in DC Comics. After 2 issues of place setting, this is where it starts to hit the fan, by which I mean the bodies hit the floor. The Anti-Monitor's antimatter wave has hit the core worlds of the DC multiverse, and the only hope any world has lies in the protection of the Monitor's vibrational towers, scattered across various points of history. It falls to Earth's heroes, and even a few villains, to protect those towers and try to save as many people as they can prior to Armageddon. As grisly as it might seem, one of the selling points of Crisis was always the body count. Worlds will live, worlds will die, yes, and just this issue we see the heroic deaths of the World War II era losers, Solivar of Gorilla City, Wild West hero Nighthawk, and the Legion's Kid Psycho. Small beer so far, perhaps, but a taste of the massacres to come. That spread of characters should give a hint as to the story's scope, as we're given glimpses of DC's entire publishing line, with speaking cameos for Sergeant Rock and the Easy Company, General Jeb Stewart and the crew of the Haunted Tank, Command D, Bat Lash and Jonah Hex, along with the Titans, the Outsiders, and the Legion of Superheroes. None of them knows what's going on yet, and the only person who does is the Monitor and his skeleton crew, one of whom, the enigmatic Harbinger, has been corrupted by the Anti-Monitor and conspires to bring about the death of her leader. Hope for the future of the universe lies in the unlikely form of Alexander Luthor, the last survivor of Earth-3, the son of that world's heroic Lex Luthor, rocketed from a dying world to carry the hope of a universe. What sticks out at almost 4 decades removed is how, steeped as we are in the language of lesser crises, nothing since has ever quite managed to rekindle this sense of genuine weight. As much as we're used to death and change being used as cynical marketing ploys, it's worth noting the deaths and changes wrought by Crisis actually were as close to permanent as comics ever get. Just last year they had another crisis, this one still ultimately dedicated to unraveling the events of the original, which against all odds proved one of the most doggedly significant comic stories ever told. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Crisis on Infinite Earths number 4 from 1985 in DC Comics. After 3 issues of preamble, the true carnage finally arrives as the core Earths of the DC multiverse, Earths 1 and 2, are both destroyed by a cloud of unstoppable antimatter. The banner atop the logo for this issue reads, "This is it, the end of the world." And sure enough, the final pages of the issue see the worlds destroyed in a blinding flash as the space they once occupied is filled by clouds of great billowing darkness. What of the Monitor's best laid plans? As there are 8 more issues left, we shall have to see. But for the small fact that the Monitor also dies here, a murder committed by his greatest friend and ally, just as antimatter washes over the remaining Earths. Now, of course, we might question the Monitor's wisdom in neglecting to inform anyone else of his plans, and furthermore, for spending years in advance of the crisis pretending to be a supervillain. But who are we to question the whims and wherefores of great cosmic entities? Considering that he knew he was going to die, surely the Monitor had a plan for that. I guess we'll have to wait to find out. As it is, we're left with the spectacle of Earth's greatest heroes facing total annihilation. The story begins with the Barbara Gordon Batgirl and the Kara Zor-El Supergirl reflecting on the futility of heroism in the face of death. Surely not a weighted conversation that will seem unmistakably poignant in hindsight. Those heroes not privy to the Monitor's counsel, that is, almost all of them, are left to spin their panicked wheels as their worlds are overcome by certain death. Among all the destruction, the Monitor's last creation makes herself known. The second Dr. Light, Kamiyo Yoshi, a diffident hero tasked by the Monitor with fulfilling an as-yet unknown role in the unfolding chaos. Another new face this issue, Lady Quark, the last survivor of Earth 6, who would later go on to be a player in Viril Dox's Legion. For all its reputation as a bloodbath, the crisis also introduced quite a few new characters, some of whom would go on to successful careers on the post-crisis Earth, and some of whom would not. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Crisis on Infinite Earths number 5 from 1985 in DC Comics. So, if last issue ended with the destruction of the Earth, this issue has to be 22 blank pages, right? Well, not quite. You see, the Monitor did actually have a plan for that. In order to protect Earths 1 and 2 from destruction by the antimatter wall, the Monitor shunted those universes into a pocket dimension formed with the energy from his demise. With the Monitor dead, it's up to Harbinger, Alexander Luthor, and the Pariah to assemble all of Earth's defenders. All of its defenders from both Earths, the past and the future, with quite a few villains sprinkled in as well. The mob scene on the Monitor satellite is one of the series' most famous images. George Pérez at the absolute height of his powers. Just look at all that detail. Even at minuscule scale, you can easily make out Easy Company's wary meeting with Swamp Thing, Lori Lamaris being carried by Aqualad, and, if you look close, Brainiac 5 and Supergirl enduring a brief reunion amidst the chaos. All time across Earth and across every world has been collapsed into a single point, and it falls to the heroes to save as many people as they can amidst the catastrophe. Meanwhile, the villain of the piece makes his move against the heroes. He's kidnapped both the Red Tornado and Barry Allen, the latter of whom is given over to the dangerously unstable psycho-pirate for torture. Now, of course, we know who the Anti-Monitor is. He's showed up numerous times since this original story, but this marks his first on-panel appearance, a revelation that surely shocked a few readers at the time. After just having seen the Monitor's tragic death, here was another Monitor, this one dedicated to the destruction of everything that has ever been. Now, after all these years, I remain baffled as to just why the Red Tornado is so prominent here, considering he doesn't really amount to much in the story. But then, that more or less describes every Red Tornado story, if we're being perfectly frank. Meanwhile, we also briefly check in with the continued impotence of the Guardians of the Universe and get our first mention of the Fourth World mythos of Jack Kirby, residing in a dimension apart from the conventional schema of multiple Earths. The issue ends with our first look at Earth X and the Freedom Fighters, residents of one of three further Earths to be explored: Earth C, home to the Charlton heroes, and of course, Earth S, home to Captain Marvel and his family. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Crisis on Infinite Earths number 6 from 1985 in DC Comics. Now, it's worth pointing out I wasn't reading Crisis' first run and only discovered the series in hindsight. This is actually the first issue of Crisis I ever read, from right smack in the middle of the story, plucked from a grimy quarter box. And let me tell you, with no other context besides a loose understanding of the history, I was hooked in a moment. Not understanding anything was, for me at that age, the greatest allure. Nothing made sense. I didn't know who half of anyone was, and all I wanted was to know more. Maybe you've been there. This issue is the last issue of setup, so to speak. The combined heroes of Earths 1 and 2 have been on the back foot for half a year by now, and next issue marks the first counterstrike against the Anti-Monitor and his plans for universal annihilation. The main event this issue, however, is pulling on the final strands of what was soon to be the revised DC Universe. This entailed reintroducing Earth X, home of Uncle Sam and the Freedom Fighters, Earth S with the Marvel family, and Earth 4, home of the former Charlton heroes. It's that last Earth that presents the most interesting challenge. Although we've already seen Blue Beetle pop up in the first issue, this is the first time the rest of the gang, Captain Atom, the Question, Judo Master, and Peacemaker, ever meet anyone from the regular DC universe, reflecting the fact that these characters were still in 1985 a very recent acquisition for the company. The machinations of the Psycho Pirate ensure the heroes of Earths 1 and 2 meet a fiery reception upon decamping to these Earths to rendezvous with their native heroes. Useless belligerence which comes to an end with the fulfillment of Harbinger's plan, shunting these additional alternate Earths into the same interdimensional limbo where the Monitor hid the first two universes. Soon they were all to be combined into one big unified Earth, and it would be difficult to argue that for all the practical difficulties presented by the maneuver, it was a benefit to the fans of those characters that their adventures could be much more readily synced to the rest of the line. The coming Justice League revamp would feature both Blue Beetle and Captain Marvel in prominent roles, a development which under the old regime could only ever been accomplished by recourse to a most inelegant kludge. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Crisis on Infinite Earths number 7 from 1985 in DC Comics. At just past the halfway mark, we pause for a brief jaunt down memory lane in the form of the origin of the DC Universe. After months of frustrating shadowboxing, the heroes of the 5 surviving Earths are brought together for an expository info dump where we learn, finally, why any of this is happening. It all goes back to Oa, of course, and specifically 1965's Green Lantern 40. If you don't have it in front of you, it's the one that details the story of Corona, the renegade scientist who sought to discover the forbidden origins of the universe, and in so doing created evil. That leads us to the famous image of the birth of the universe, a giant hand cradling the primeval galaxy. Cronus sees something he's not supposed to see, but the consequences were greater than anyone knew. In that moment, Cronus' ill-fated experiment shattered the universe, creating both the multiverse of infinite positive matter Earths as well as their single antimatter counterpart, familiar to DC readers since 1960's Green Lantern number 2. The creation of the antimatter universe resulted in the creation of the Anti-Monitor, a kind of universal avatar, as well as his equal and opposite number, the Monitor of the positive matter multiverse. These two cosmic beings waged a war for many millions of years before entering a bitter stalemate, a stalemate only broken when Pariah, a scientist from another long-forgotten Earth, replicated Cronus' forbidden experiment and in so doing unleashed the wave of antimatter that destroyed his world and countless others. Which brings us to the present of the story, with only 5 Earths remaining and the heroes of those worlds assembled to finally take the battle back to the monster monster at the heart of the carnage, except this was never going to be an easy battle and a clean fight. The Anti-Monitor was too strong, and here the stakes of the story come into brutal focus. No spoiler, it's right there on the cover of this double-sized shocker. One of the most famous images in DC history, Superman cradling his dead cousin in his arms. Simply infiltrating the Anti-Monitor's satellite fortress taxes the assembled heroes to their utmost, and when they penetrate the heart of the maze and face the Anti-Monitor himself, they face a villain at the absolute height of his powers. First to engage is the Superman of Earth-1, the greatest and most powerful of them all, but even he is no match for the Anti-Monitor. In an instant, Kara Zor-El makes a fateful choice to save her cousin's life by taking his place in battle, forcing the villain back with her Kryptonian strength and surprising savagery. In the battle, she's able to destroy both the Anti-Monitor's containment armor as well as the hideous machinery, speeding the compression of the remaining Earths, saving the day in her final moments. For all that we've become accustomed to death as a transient gimmick in these stories, this still packs a wallop. Although many Supergirls have taken her place in the long 4 decades since, even many further iterations of Kara Zor-El, it's worth emphasizing the original Supergirl has never returned. Her heroic sacrifice remains arguably the greatest such death ever seen in comics, with its only real competition, in my humble opinion, to follow in the very next issue. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Crisis on Infinite Earths number 8 from 1985 in DC Comics. When the Crisis is remembered, it's often reduced to 2 moments, the deaths of Supergirl and the Flash. Of these 2, as I said last time, only Supergirl has never been reversed. Sadly, Barry Allen returned in 2008's Final Crisis, an unforgivable stain on an otherwise very decent story, and certainly a better sequel to this series than the regrettable Infinite Crisis. That return undercuts one of the great deaths in comic book history. However, before Barry's last stand, the book has to deal with a number of outstanding plots, as well as feeding line to an increasing number of crossovers. Wolfman has discussed the difficulty of writing the later stretch of the book after it was already a success and he had to accommodate an increasing number of crossover titles that understandably wanted to slipstream behind the sales juggernaut. So we have passages with the Omega Men, Blue Devil, and the Atom that go nowhere, not to mention another brief appearance by the Guardians of the Universe, finally released from stasis and still bickering. Their contribution to the Crisis was mostly confined to Steve Englehart's run on Green Lantern, a sequence that also included the introduction of the modern iteration of Guy Gardner. If the Crisis was threatening to spin out of control, it still looked excellent. The necessity of plot discussion has sadly kept me from lingering too long on the book's most exemplary feature, that is, the art. The indefatigable George Pérez never flagging once from beginning to end, accompanied for most of the book by Jerry Ordway. Ordway is better known as a penciler in his own right, but his finishes are distinctive and entirely complementary to Pérez. The result is a book that never stops being gorgeous even when it bogs down in the weeds. But this issue's all about the Flash. With the Anti-Monitor's first plan wrecked by Supergirl, his follow-up is also pretty sound. Just shoot the Earth with a giant antimatter cannon. After the better part of a year of helplessly watching the carnage, Barry escapes and marshals his strength for one last run, racing against time to destroy the cannon, which would surely destroy the planet in a single shot. A characteristically selfless sacrifice from the man who launched the Silver Age, his death serving as portent for many things to follow. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Crisis on Infinite Earths number 9 from 1985 in DC Comics. After the fireworks of the last 2 issues, the Crisis seems to downshift for a moment. The 5 Earths still hang perilously close in time, but with the threat of the Anti-Monitor seemingly resolved, the heroes can certainly relax, right? Well, not quite. The last few issues have seen a running subplot of supervillains disappearing out from under everyone's noses. Now we find out what they've been up to. Brainiac and Lex Luthor, the Luthor of Earth-1, mind you, have assembled the supervillains of 5 Earths to conquer, striking just when the heroes least expect, because of course, one should never let a good crisis go to waste. But the question remains, is the crisis actually over? Clearly not, since the pariah disappears mid-sentence while addressing the United Nations. Something else still remains to be destroyed, leading to next issue and the dramatic death of the multiverse itself. The main event for this series, in other words. Of course, getting rid of the multiverse, although it unquestionably was a boon for the line at the time, eventually became a kind of scab, one that the company still to this day cannot resist picking. But That's not Marv Wolfman's fault. His job here is to sell the scope of the destruction, so this issue alone sees cameos from the Balloon Buster, the Creeper, Rex Hunter, Darwin Jones, and yes, even Sugar and Spike pop in for a single panel. There are also a few pages of crossover maintenance, including checking in on the perpetual impotence of the Guardians of the Universe, whose great idea in the face of multiversal annihilation is to bring back Guy Gardner. Meanwhile, Donna Troy is upset because she can't find her husband, Terry Long. While most people would have taken the opportunity to drop Terry into a wave of antimatter, sadly, that's not to be the case here. Incidentally, this is probably my favorite cover out of the series. Not perhaps the most iconic image from the book, but an example of just why George Pérez was such a supremely special talent. Dozens of characters in garish costumes packed into an absurdly busy composition, and yet somehow it works. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Crisis on Infinite Earths number 10 from 1985 in DC Comics. After the deceptive quiet of the last issue, the Spectre shows up. This was teased at the end of issue 8, and he's back here, bearing the news that not only is the Anti-Monitor still alive, but he's waiting for them at the dawn of time. Now, if you've read any of these crossovers, you know there's always a reason why the Spectre can't just step in to lend a hand. Accordingly, we haven't seen the Spectre do anything to stop the Anti-Monitor so far, because the Anti-Monitor has been smart enough to remain in the antimatter universe, where the Spectre apparently has no jurisdiction. But once the Anti-Monitor leaves his universe to travel back to the dawn of all time, all bets are off. Meanwhile, the villains assembled by Brainiac and Luthor are drafted into the war, given that the stakes are all existence, and tasked with a crucial chore, traveling back in time to ancient Oa to stop Krona before his ill-fated experiment splinters the universes. Now, if you know anything about physics, the question of why there happened to be just a little bit more regular matter than antimatter at the dawn of time is a real question, with significant consequences for the shape of our existence. So now you know. The Spectre is the reason why antimatter was defeated at the dawn of time. Of course, this issue ends on something of a cliffhanger, with all existence supposedly destroyed in the cosmic brawl. What's really destroyed here, however, is the multiverse itself, which we've learned was only ever a mistake, a tragic consequence of Krona's ill-fated experiment and the Anti-Monitor's diabolic meddling. Accordingly, these pages mark the very last appearance of the classic multiverse, originally seen in Flash number 123 in 1961, some 24 years previous. Strange to reflect, that multiverse has been gone for almost twice as long as it was around to begin with, and creators haven't stopped pining in all the years since. Meanwhile, much of the issue is devoted to catching up with the rest of the line, with the Monitor Tapes feature occupying the bottom fifth of every page, alluding to consequences of the war for the Legion of Superheroes, Tommy Tomorrow, the Forever People, Amethyst of Gemworld, the Omega Men, even the Gods of Olympus. All a preview for another project to emerge from the ashes of the crisis, also from the team of Wolfman and Pérez, the history of the DC Universe. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Crisis on Infinite Earths number 11 from 1985 in DC Comics. After last issue's climactic war at the dawn of time, the survivors wake up on a new Earth with a new history. The opening sequence here recalls the beginning of the first issue, a glimpse at the new status quo of a single universe created from the remains of Minnie. The bulk of the issue is given over to explaining the mechanics of the new Earth, albeit in a fashion that leaves as many questions unanswered, if not more, than those with which they started. Crisis 11 is a strange story inasmuch as it posits that no one on the new Earth remembers the old multiverse except for those characters who were involved in the battle at the dawn of time in Crisis 10. Of course, no one involved in the production of this comic knew what John Byrne's Man of Steel was going to look like, as its publication still lay the better part of a year in the future. But the main Superman here must indeed be that Superman. However, Lex Luthor is still a criminal here, locked in a cell, as opposed to the tycoon of the Byrne revamp. The pre-Crisis Wonder Woman appears on the new Themyscira, not the version seen in George Pérez's subsequent Wonder Woman revamp, which didn't yet exist. There would be a significant chunk of comics published in the strange continuity rump of the post-crisis pre-Man of Steel New Earth, as the old status quos were gradually superseded by the new tighter continuity that came to be embraced with the first wave of books launched after these events. If all that sounds unavoidably headache-inducing, well, yes, it is. I loved this kind of inside baseball when I was a kid, but I accept your mileage may vary. It may very well be fair to say that when it launched, no one really had any clue just how far far-reaching the new Crisis would turn out to be, as a crossover that obligated every book in the line not merely to pay lip service to a cosmetic change, but to reorient itself to a new cosmos. Superman and Wonder Woman got all new makeovers, although the question of just when Wonder Woman first entered man's world would prove a thorny wrinkle, as would the provenance of Power Girl, a loose thread that is, as of this writing, still being worried almost 4 decades after the fact. Eventually, almost all of these characters would forget about the existence of the multiverse, with only a very small coterie even remembering that there had been such an event as Crisis on Infinite Earths, or the existence of Kara Zor-El, or Helena Wayne. It's that small group of refugees from Earth 2 who remain the biggest sore spot from the whole affair. If Captain Marvel and the Freedom Fighters could fit rather cleanly on a new Earth to which they represented a new addition, there was simply no solution possible for a clutch of characters made redundant by fiat of space-time. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Crisis on Infinite Earths number 12 from 1985 in DC Comics. And so the biggest story in DC history comes to a close. As promised, nothing was ever the same again to a degree that no one could have anticipated. The DC universe as it existed was gone, never to return. For all the ink subsequent creators spilled towards undoing the streamlining wrought here, Wolfman and Pérez built a machine that was simply too good at its job, laying down foundation stones for a new universe whether the rest of the company wanted or not. I'll still argue that on balance, many of the changes were necessary. For all that we focus on the problems with the post-crisis landscape, the Legion of Superheroes, Hawkman, and Power Girl spring immediately to mind. The fact is that New Earth was a popular setting, and having all the characters in one place was necessary and generative. Crisis was designed to clear the decks, however, and before it was over, there was a steep body count to be reckoned with. Just this final issue sees the deaths of Lori Lamaris, Prince Rawman, the original Dove, and Cole of the Teen Titans, to say nothing of the last few unique survivors of Earth 2 who had managed to survive until now: Green Arrow, Robin, and the Helena Wayne Huntress. Very convenient deaths from the perspective of the new Earth, with almost every reminder of the old status quo very tidily swept under the rug. Wonder Woman comes in for a fair amount of complication, with the Earth 1 Wonder Woman erased in time, and the Earth 2 Wonder Woman ascending bodily to Olympus to live as a guest of the Greek gods. Like Superman, Wonder Woman's entire history prior to 1986 was erased by this sequence. Unlike Superman, however, the man responsible for fixing the mess was actually directly involved in making it in the first place, with George Pérez both drawing and writing the reboot that followed later that year. As for the story itself, it's the last stand of the Anti-Monitor. After seeing his best-laid plans come to naught based solely on the intransigence of Earth, all he really cares about is destroying our planet. He begins the issue by pulling Earth into the antimatter universe and flooding the world with demons, a 5-alarm emergency for every surviving hero. Accordingly, the issue is packed with characters up to the very end, with the Global Guardians, Hawk and Dove, the Challengers of the Unknown, and the Forgotten Heroes all playing a role. That last group ends up playing the crucial part, drafting Brainiac in a last-minute attempt to seek help from the last creature in all of existence to keep their powder dry against the Anti-Monitor, Darkseid himself, who waits until the last possible moment to score the decisive blow in the final battle. On the side of the Angels here, at least, out of pure calculated self-preservation. Ultimately, however, the final battle of the story comes down to a seemingly inevitable grudge match between the Anti-Monitor and Superman, but not the Earth 1 Superman, but the Man of Steel of Earth 2, the first Superman, and the first superhero. Having lost everything over the course of the series, Superman gives his all in the final push against the greatest evil he's ever met. And then, at the last minute, after the villain has been vanquished, Alexander Luthor appears to allow Superman and his wife, the first Lois Lane, along with Superboy Prime, to ascend to heaven, rather than to die stoically in the wake of the Anti-Monitor's demise. And if the story had ended here, it would have stood as the most perfect ending imaginable. A dignified retirement for the man himself, the very guy who lifted that car on the cover of Action Comics number 1, having to save the world one more time on his way out the door. But alas, I don't want to mince words here. It is categorically unforgivable that this blindingly perfect ending was undone in the build-up to Infinite Crisis. The first and greatest of all superheroes deserved the dignity of a happy ending, and walking back that ending should have been a fireable offense for Mr. Jeff Johns. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at the Legends of the DC Universe Crisis on Infinite Earths special from 1998 in DC Comics. Just when you thought we were done with the Crisis, a timely reminder that the Crisis will never be done with us. In 1998, DC launched Legends of the DC Universe, an anthology in the same mold as their long-running Legends of the Dark Knight. Just as that series was premised on offering different arcs by different A-list creators, so too did the DC Universe Companion. And just as that series sought to plug holes in Batman's revamped history, so too did DC Universe work within the general remit of the post-Crisis continuity. The present volume was offered to coincide with the inaugural compilation of the Crisis between two covers. In 1998, DC solicited the first ever reprint of the book in a limited edition hardcover slipcase, long delayed and entailing a great deal of restoration work. I've never even seen a copy, despite asking my store at the time to order one. Quantities were limited, they said, although it wouldn't be but a few more years before the series was finally issued in softcover. But the first Crisis collection was a big enough deal for the company to go back for one more bucket from the well, so to speak, with Marv Wolfman on board for a lost chapter of the epic. George Pérez was at the time knee-deep in his magisterial return to Marvel's Avengers with Kurt Busiek, so his chair was filled ably by the late Paul Ryan. Ryan might be more familiar to readers from his work at Marvel, notably DP7 with Mark Gruenwald, along with a lengthy run on Fantastic Four with Tom DeFalco. By the end of the decade, Ryan was working regularly at DC, and his felicity with ensemble cast made him the logical choice for this special. Now, the question remains, after 12 long issues of just about the densest superhero book that has ever been made, was there a need for another chapter, especially 13 years later? As much as I wish I could say the present issue offers an integral piece to the story, I can't really say it's a necessary addendum. On the contrary, the book seems to step on the toes of the original. The Flash's disappearance in Crisis is a mystery for everyone who knew the man in the 20th century. After issue 350 of his own book, the Flash escapes for the 30th century for a happily ever after with the love of his life, Iris West. The pathos of his death in the original Crisis stems to a large degree on the fact that it's a lonely death. No one knew where Barry Allen had disappeared to, or what his mysterious reappearances mean throughout the story, not until the very end. Here, however, we see the precise chain of events leading to Barry leading the 30th century, as well as his last adventure with his friends in the JLA. On leaving the 30th century, he lands on Earth D, a heretofore unseen variant protected by a multiracial Justice Alliance, consisting of all new versions of familiar characters, including Tanaka Ray, a new Flash who recognizes Barry Allen as a character from the comic books he read as a kid, just as Barry had recognized Jay Garrick. It doesn't take him long to figure out that everything's about to fall apart, and before it does, Barry is joined by his friends from Earth 1, the Justice League, along with a few others like Nightwing, Starfire, and Dawnstar, apparently still hanging around the 20th century at that moment. The whole episode takes place between panels of Crisis number 4. The heroes from Earth 1 stick around Earth D to help them save as many people as they can from their dying world, mere millions to offset the deaths of untold billions, before our familiar heroes return to the Monitor satellite and the Justice Alliance stay back to face certain death at the Atom Matter Wall. While one can certainly understand Wolfman's desire to have another shot at such a big target, I remain unconvinced that the present volume adds anything of note. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Mighty Mouse number 4 from 1990 in Marvel Comics. Yes, you heard me right. Not a hoax, nor a dream, or even an imaginary story. Chapter 1 of Mice on Infinite Earths, starring none other than Mighty Mouse himself. 5 years after the original Crisis, Marvel Comics released their own version of the seminal maxi series, featuring the Mouse of Tomorrow struggling to avert the destruction of his universe and the universes of every anthropomorphic character in all cartoons. The story begins much as the regular Crisis, with the pitiful piranha appearing on doomed worlds to weep at the carnage. We are introduced not to Mighty Mouse, but his distaff counterpart, Mighty Mousette, drafted by Hairbinger to meet the Minotaur, the creature responsible for maintaining the health of the anthropomorphic universes. His evil doppelganger is, you guessed it, the Anti-Minotaur, whose smoke-belching anti-motor belches evil smoke that consumes entire worlds. The Minotaur's motor has seen better days, just barely able to maintain the energy necessary to support the continued existence of the funny animal universes. If you're wondering why Marvel devoted 2 issues to spoofing a crossover from a half-decade previous, then you need look no further than the rest of Mighty Mouse's short-lived series, which was filled with relentless spoofing of then-current superhero books, from John Byrne's Namor to Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man. And somehow David Letterman sneaks in too. As parodies go, this is a close and faithful reading of the original series, albeit necessarily with significantly fewer characters. Michael Gallagher comes with a significant pedigree, having written most all of Alf for Marvel, as well as significant runs on Sonic the Hedgehog and the 90s Guardians of the Galaxy. He was also, interestingly, the son son of National Cartoonist Society Award winner John Gallagher, as well as George Gately's nephew, which might help explain Heathcliff's long run at the House of Ideas. The art team here is worth singling out for praise itself, considering of two peerless legends, Ernie Colon penciling and Mary Severin inking. The result is a comic book that looks so much better than Mighty Mouse has any business looking, and that's not even mentioning the cover, actually, literally, for real, drawn by George Pérez himself. Mighty Mousette might not have the pedigree of a Supergirl, but her heroic death at the hands of the Anti-Minotaur is no less tragic. Okay, maybe slightly less tragic, but still pretty heavy for a Star comic all the same. Howdy, folks! Today we're looking at Mighty Mouse number 5 from 1990 in Marvel Comics. And so finally we reach the end of our journey with the concluding chapter of Mices on Infinite Earths. We've seen Crisis adapted to live-action television and direct-to-video animation, and the mythology laid down by Wolfman and Pérez has proven a sturdy enough backdrop for decades of subsequent iterations. What began in the early 80s as a wild idea by Marv Wolfman to streamline DC's publishing line became one of the company's most famous stories, as well as a brand in and of itself, parodied in the pages of the competition's magazines. As for Mighty Mouse, well, he's fighting mad following the death of Mighty Mousette, enough to assemble a team of the most powerful heroes on his world, including Bat-Bat, the League of Super Rodents, and even his greatest enemy, the Cow. But even this star-studded team isn't quite enough to defeat the Anti-Minotaur. The ultimate call to save the day goes out for Super Mouse. Super Mouse? Yes, in 1942, this early progenitor of Mighty Mouse premiered from the Terry Toon Studio as a direct spoof of Superman. Then in his first blush of animated success following the premiere of the famous Max Fleischer Superman cartoons. So it all comes full circle. Mighty Mouse isn't owned by DC or Warner Brothers, but is nonetheless a direct descendant of the Man of Steel. Only fitting that since the Golden Age Superman finished the battle in the original Crisis, so too does his original parody deliver the final blow against the Anti-Minotaur. And that's not all. This issue of Mighty Mouse features a backup starring the aforementioned Bat-Bat, investigating a threat to the premiere of the sequel to his blockbuster movie Bat-Bat 2. The most interesting thing about this particular backup is the writing team, Mike Kantarovich and none other than Tom Brevoort himself, one of many freelance credits from the early years of one of the company's most significant editors. The villain? Why, none other than Clive Barkman, horror writer and movie director extraordinaire. As if you needed any more proof that Clive Barker was everywhere at early 90s Marvel, even the Batman spoof back up in a Star comic. Again, the real reason to pick this up if you see it, inking throughout by the legendary Marie Severin, over both Ernie Colon in the first strip and Mike Cazalet on the backup.